everybody. My name is Janneke Hille, and I'm a professor at University of Washington in Seattle. And today I'm really excited to tell you about MeadoWatch, which is a citizen science program I set up in 2013. Since 2013, myself and a number of members of my lab, some of which are listed here, have been working with volunteers to try to understand how climate change may alter the timing of flowering in the lush wildflower meadows you see pictured here, and that Mount Rainier is known for. So I'm going to tell you more about MeadoWatch by answering three questions. The first, how will climate change affect one wildflower's flower? In other words, when will we see these beautiful scenes of lupin flowering up in the high wildflower meadows? Then I'm going to answer whether these effects are consistent across wildflower species. In other words, are all wildflowers will they be similarly affected by climate change, or will climate change perhaps reshuffle the combination of wildflowers that flower together? And finally, I'll spend a bit of time talking about the implications of these changes to the timing and composition of the wildflower season, what implications that might have for the plants that are flowering, for the pollinators that are interacting with the wildflowers, and for visitors, many of whom come to Mount Rainier National Park to see the beautiful wildflowers bloom. So I'll start by telling you, before answering those questions, a little bit about the study system and methods. So this is Mount Rainier, seen in the fall. And I really like this picture because it does a really good job of showing where exactly the subalpine and alpine wildflower meadows are that are a subject of study here. What you see here at lower elevations is the dark green coniferous forests. And in that yellow reddish band, due to the fall colors, you can see the 300 to 400 meter altitudinal band of wildflower meadows that occurs above tree line, above trees, and below glaciers and rocks. A couple of things about those wildflower meadows. Because they're so high up, the growing season for plants and the other organisms that occur there is really strongly constrained by climate. And that's really obvious when looking at this picture, which was taken in May of 2014. You can see that there's still 2 to 3 meters of snow on the ground at that point. So there's really only 3 to 4 months that these wildflower meadows are free of snow. And that really tells us that the growing season and thus the flowering of these wildflowers could be strongly constrained by climate, namely snow. So the wildflowers we find up there are super diverse, lots of different colored flowers coming from lots of different families, lots of different pollinators, from butterflies to bees to syrphid flies to hummingbirds. The flowers provide rich resources for these pollinators in the form of nectar or pollen, and the fruits that these flowers eventually develop into also provide resources both for insect, seed, and fruit predators, as well as mammals. For example, the vacciniums, the huckleberries that turn into fruits that bears like to gorge on in August and September. So we set about studying the timing of the wildflower season using a citizen science approach. And you might be wondering, why would we use a citizen science approach? After all, I could use a more standard scientific approach, which is recruiting graduate students and basically sending a team of graduate students and undergraduate research scientists out there to collect this data. Well, a couple of different reasons that I wanted to set this up as a citizen science program. First of all, it's my firm belief that science is for everybody, and yet this is often not the message we get from around us. For example, this is a recent Google search I did where I just typed in famous scientists, and while all these different scientists, many of whom you probably recognize, are contributed a lot to our scientific discovery, I think we can all agree that these group of scientists do not well represent the diversity and the composition of our communities around us. On a slightly less altruistic note, it's also true that as a scientist, I'm always limited by resources. There's never enough time to collect all the data that I might want to collect. And Mount Rainier National Park sees about 2 million visitors a year, and many of them come to see these beautiful wildflowers. So it occurred to me that if I could just harness a few of these volunteers in helping me collect data, that this would allow me to get a lot more data than I might otherwise. But on the whole, I would say that it's really been the opportunity to share my lab's science, my love of ecology, and our concern about climate change with volunteers and visitors that has made the MeadoWatch program so rewarding, both for myself and for all my lab members who've been involved in it. All right, so how does this program work? Basically, we ask volunteers to do what many of them already would really love to do in the summer. They hike along true trails, and they've been doing this since 2013. And along those true trails, they stop at 27 different locations, and those locations are marked with these survey markers that are put in the trail ground. These we consider our plots. Once a volunteer gets to a plot, they look and a plot area, which they basically measure using their own body, 1 arm span by 1 wingspan. And in that plot area, they look for 16 focal wildflower species, and they tell us for those wildflower species that they find, which of the following 4 phenophases they can see. So do they see buds? Do they see flowers? Do they see fruits? Or do they see seeds? They simply circle yes or no on a data sheet and send that information back to us. Now, in addition to that information about when buds, flowers, fruits, and seeds of these different species are occurring in these different plots, we also bury microclimate sensors at the base of every plot every year, and these microclimate sensors measure temperature. And they allow us to understand exactly when snow melted from that location. Snow is an excellent insulator, so as soon as snow covers up these microclimate sensors, they measure 0 degrees Celsius, and they, like at all times and hours of day. And as soon as they're uncovered by snow, they measure the daily cycle of temperature, so lots more variability and not at 0. All right, so that's the data, and that takes us back to these 3 questions. So we'll start by asking, how will climate change alter when wildflowers flower? All right, so first I need to tell you or show you a little bit about this data. So what you see here is the data that was collected from 1 plot in 1 year for the flowering of glacier lily, 1 species. So on the x-axis here, you see time, June, July, and August of the summer season. And on the y-axis, you see points that indicate yes, so up at the top of the graph, if glacier lily flowers were observed, or no at the bottom of the graph if they were not. And as an example, Abby Howell hiked on July 23rd of 2017, and she indicated on her data sheet that on that day, she did not see any glacier lily flowering. So this graph already tells us a lot about when we might see wildflowers of the species at this plot, sort of early July. But we can actually do a lot better than that. We can use a statistical model and fit a curve which tells us what is the probability of observing a flower as a function of time for that particular species in that particular plot and that particular year. And that curve also allows us to estimate what was the timing of peak flowering. When were you most likely to see a flower? And from the plant's point of view, when was flowering at its peak? So that, in this case, for this species, this plot was July 6th. Now recall that we also have information on when snow melted from that plot. And in this case, that was June 26th. So what these 2 pieces of information collected over many years at many sites for many different species allow us to do, it allows us to ask, if snowmelt occurs earlier or later, does peak flowering follow snowmelt around? In other words, at this plot in this year, if snowmelt had occurred on May 1st, would peak flowering have also occurred up to a month earlier? And indeed, yes, we find that that's the case. So here's the data for subalpine lupin. On the x-axis here is the date of snowmelt, and on the y-axis is the date that peak flowering or peak seeding was observed for that species. So each of those dots represents 1 plot and 1 year when flowering for subalpine lupin and when flowering in seed set was observed. And what you can see is that in plots and years when snowmelt was earlier, peak flowering and peak seeding also occurred earlier. So indeed, that suggests that as climate changes and snowmelt occurs earlier, we should see earlier flowering and earlier reproduction of all these different species. Now I'm only showing you the data for one species, for lupin, but we found this kind of relationship with earlier snowmelt leading to earlier flowering or seed set for all the species we looked at. Now, temperature, so how warm it is and how moist the soils were, also mattered, but a lot less. Now, you may be wondering, how concerned are we that this data was collected by volunteers, many of whom don't necessarily know a lot about flowers, they're amateur botanists. And in fact, we're very confident in the data that we have gotten from our volunteers. And this is because when we compare the peak flowering estimates we get from data that was collected by members of our lab, shown on the x-axis of this graph here, versus the peak flowering estimate as collected by volunteers, they really line up very well on the one-to-one line. What that's telling us is that if we had sent out a team of graduate students or undergraduates, we would have come to much the same estimates as our volunteers do. So we are incredibly confident and really excited about the data that our volunteers are collecting. All right, I hope I've convinced you that earlier snowmelt should lead to earlier flowering, and that should shift the entire wildflower season earlier. However, what I want to think about next is whether these effects are consistent across wildflower species. In other words, as snow melts earlier, will all the different wildflower species shift their flowering earlier at the same rate, or will we see different combinations of species flowering at the same time because some species are shifting their flowering a lot while other species are shifting their flowering not so much? So the way I want to answer this question is by looking at the relationship between snowmelt and peak flowering across many different species. So on the graph on the left, for example, you see for Sitka valerian, like I showed you for lupin a couple of slides ago, the relationship between the date of snowmelt on the x-axis and the date of peak flowering. So each of those dots represents a different plot in a different year where Sitka valerian was observed flowering relative to the date of snowmelt in that plot. The gray line represents the relationship, so the shift in flowering date for each day that snow melts earlier. Now, if we take that gray line and look at the slopes of those lines for all the different species, we can then ask whether they're the same or they're different. And that's the graph I'm showing you here on the right. So again, on the x-axis is date of snowmelt, and on the y-axis is date of peak flowering. And now what you see is 10 colored lines representing that relationship for 10 different species. Now there's two things I want you to take away from this graph. The first is that the slopes of those lines are all negative. In other words, as snow melts earlier, which is what we expect to happen with climate change, all of these different wildflower species are going to shift their flowering earlier. However, the second thing I want you to notice about this graph is that the slopes of those lines are different. And what that means is that as climate change causes snow to melt earlier, the order in which species flower and the combination of flowers that occur at the same time is going to shift. So for example, if snow melted in July, the last species we would see flowering according to this graph is Cascade aster. However, if snow were to melt in late April or early May, instead, broadleaf arnica, which is the orange line, is the species we would predict to see last flowering. Now, a slightly easier way to look at this is by comparing what the wildflower season looks like in 2 different years. So that's the graph. Those are the graphs I'm showing you here. On the top is what the wildflower season looked like on our Reflection Lakes trail in a year when snow melted very early, and that was in 2015. So each of those curves represents a different wildflower species and the timing of when it was observed flowering. The graph on the bottom shows exactly the same species, but in a year when snow melted late, around July. So the main thing to take away from this is, had you gone hiking on these trails in 2015 when snow melted really early, the wildflower season would have looked quite different. You would have seen, it would have been longer, it would have been earlier, but you would have seen less species overlap and flowering at the same time. All right, so hopefully you're convinced that climate change is going to influence when wildflowers flower at Mount Rainier National Park. Flowering is going to shift earlier and the wildflower season is going to shift earlier. And secondly, I hope you're also convinced that species really respond individualistically to shifts in climate, which means that the wildflower community we see out there might be really different in terms of the combinations of species we see flowering together, and even the length of the flowering season and how and what the diversity of wildflowers is at any one point in time. So the last thing I want to leave you with is some speculation about what these kinds of potential changes might mean for the plants, who are the ones that are shifting their flowering, for pollinators that are interacting with plants, and finally, what this might mean to visitors to Mount Rainier National Park. So this is all speculative. So let's start by just a visual schematic showing you across the top June, July, August, and September, and the approximate timing right now of when we see snow melt, which is in early July, and when we see these different species flowering. So with climate change, we know snow is going to melt earlier, and we know species are going to shift their flowering earlier, but at different rates. So for plant species, like this Castanea, this is hypothetical by the way, that doesn't shift as much as other species, it's possible that if they can't keep up with climate change, that they will lose the opportunity to have as full of a growing season, which could have negative consequences for their reproduction. The other thing that this might influence is the interactions between plants and their pollinators. So pollinators are out there and they have their very own, they may have their very own shifts in the timing of their activities, and they're going to encounter different groups of species, and that could have potential consequences for their fitness as well. Let's think now about what this means for visitors. So again, this is kind of what we consider an average year right now, where snow is melting in early July, and we see sequence of wildflowers till late September. We see peak visitation in late July and early August. Now, we're assuming that with climate change, if wildflowers shift their flowering earlier, causing the wildflower season to occur earlier, we are assuming that visitors will also shift their activity earlier, but we don't actually know this. Visitors may be consulting guidebooks that may not have updated the timing of the wildflower season, or they may be constrained, for example, by the school holidays. So if visitors are not able to shift their behavior in such a way that they're visiting Mount Rainier National Park when the visitors are at their peak wildflower season, fewer of them may experience these beautiful wildflower meadows that Mount Rainier is so known for. All right, so I hope I've given you some great food for thought and some information about our MeadoWatch program. What I'd like to do now is just acknowledge all the many people from my lab, as well as from Mount Rainier National Park, that have been so instrumental in helping us set up and keep this program running. Here's just a few of the people that have helped out. I also would like to give a shout out to our 400 plus volunteers over the last 6 or 7 years who have collected data enthusiastically, come to orientations, and sent us fun pictures and notes about their experience on the trail. So with that, if you have any questions, I don't actually know if I'm going to be virtually around when you're watching this, but if I am, obviously feel free to ask me questions. And if not, please feel free to email me. My email address is up there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.